Hey, welcome back on Good Morning Artesia. Mayor Ray Miller is with us. And, Mayor, I was going to ask you a question totally off topic. They have nothing to do with city council, but you're in the oil and gas business.
Right.
And I guess there's some issues with the government and leases and whether or not they have to be considered economic impact of environmental stuff and things like that. What's happening in all that area there? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, my insight is probably too simplistic, but during the Obama administration, they basically put the coal industry out of business, and I'm not sure that the Biden administration agenda is not to put oil and gas out of business. And if you look at some of the bills that were actually considered in our legislative session in Santa Fe, the progressives and obviously the Democratic Party is in the majority, and a lot of them have some very progressive liberal positions. Had some of those items passed, it would have been, a death nail into our business. And to me, Gina, I am dismayed to a degree simply because I believe that our country will need oil and gas for years to come, no matter how quickly we try to transition away from fossil fuels. But if we basically kill our domestic industry, then the needs for it that we have will be importing from places like Nigeria and Venezuela. And I'm sure that they have great environmental programs in each one of those countries associated with their oil and gas.
I hear the sarcasm. Well, but you're right. You're
it winds
exactly
up
right.
being a thing where every barrel that gets imported into the United States has more emissions associated with it than a barrel produced here.
Oh, yeah.
So you would actually think if the goal of the environmental community was to actually reduce emissions, that as long as we have to have a barrel, they would want it produced in the domestic market under regulatory regime that reduces as much emissions. And I mean, the major companies, well, in fact, every company in southeast New Mexico is working to try to reduce as much of the emissions associated with production as they can. And I mean, what the industry does today versus what we did when I started in 1980 or 1990 or the year 2000 or the year 2010, every year or every 10 years, if you look back, you can see a transition from a less environmental problems to where we are today, and a result in, the focus by every company at this point is to how to reduce their emissions even more. Well, I don't believe that Nigeria, Venezuela, and many places that produce oil and
Russia,
gas,
for that matter,
and Russia have those same environmental agendas. And to a degree, you look, my understanding is at this point the need for electricity in China, they've demanded or fired up more of their coal-fired power plants, because of the need for industry and electricity demand than, what they could do with their new renewables and stuff. And as a result, I love folks, hearts for thinking that, that this is a plan that we have to do. Sometimes, though, I become a little bit of a skeptic because I recognize that sometimes you can have volcanic eruptions that actually spew more gases into the atmosphere than what all of industry or humankind is doing, in man-made.
Well, the volcano is now, and you compare it to the history of the Industrial Revolution.
I mean, we've had ice ages come and go over this planet, and we weren't burning fossil fuels during them, before or after. And, so there are some things that are not man-controlled, and yet our focus today is on everything being looked at strictly as that,
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't...
But wasn't there a lawsuit or something that judge in Louisiana put on hold, and so the leases on the federal lands is kind of in the air right now until that all works its way.
Yeah, and it winds up being a thing where we're fortunate in southeast New Mexico that most of the lands that are seen as productive at this point are already under lease and available for development.
Okay.
But the speed at which BLM process permits, the regulations that come from OCD and the Environment Department in Santa Fe, and then the enforcement of those. I know my wife was reading a couple of the fines that were issued yesterday and publicized in the Albuquerque Journal, and I think XTO was fined $2 million for violations. Well, it makes great press. But at the same time, it also tells, ExxonMobil, which is the parent of XTO, that, is New Mexico the place that we want to be investing new capital dollars? And it's a thing where, our state had great surpluses this year, and a good portion of those surpluses is directly related to the economic activity, the new developments that have been occurring in the South Eddy, South Lee part of the Permian Basin, and there is great potential in those areas for a lot of future development for years to come that would be highly economic. And at these price levels, they're just unbelievably economic. I mean, I was looking at a well that EOG drilled the other day, and its first 2 months of production would have paid for the $8 to $9 million of drilling and development costs that they actually had. Now, every well isn't that successful,
right?
But you sit there and go, well, that's a huge, financial return that then they have, years of production after that will basically help cover their overhead and cover, failures that they may have and the success of other wells. But there is a huge opportunity at this point to see great benefits. Years ago, Senator Eddie Lopez was one of the strongest supporters of oil and gas, and he was a senator from Santa Fe. And I finally, at the end of one of the legislative sessions in the early 80s, I asked the NMOGA lobbyist, I says, well, why does Senator Lopez actually support oil and gas? Does he have an interest in southeast New Mexico or northwest New Mexico where he has a tie to it? And he says no, because at that time Max Call was also a representative from Santa Fe.
I remember that
his
name.
Family had interest in southeast New Mexico, which afforded him the ability to be almost a freewheeling hippie Santa Fe resident, but comfortable living from the southeast oil patch. And the answer from the lobbyist was no. Senator Lopez has been around the legislature long enough, served on Senate Finance, and he recognizes that the better that the oil and gas industry does, the less every taxpayer in his district pays less in taxes and receives more in services from the state of New Mexico because of a healthy oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
And it's a simple message. Over 30% of the state's revenue and budget comes directly from southeast New Mexico and northwest New Mexico. And at this price level in the southeast, we're making a huge contribution into the state budget, but the state seems bent on wanting to actually put us out of business to where we afford the opportunity for the state to use higher emission fuels.
I know.
And all of our stuff, and to wind up having to, it's like at this point, the refinery is a large user of the water in the city. Well, if the refinery didn't buy city water, we'd basically have to double everybody's water bill to have the same revenue stream to pay for the city infrastructure to actually operate that utility. And as a result, I really appreciate Navajo.
Sure. And I think most people do. At least I hope most people do. I think the other thing that's going to be interesting is that apparently the Speaker of the House, Brian Egoff, announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election. And so that's a pretty important leadership position in the legislature in New Mexico. Be interesting to see.
Hugely important, and I was very surprised at his decision. You know, last thing from the council last night, we had some executive sessions, but largely the results of those was not, it was primarily giving the council information regarding real estate issues. We had 3 different ones: a potential lease, a trespass issue, and also a possible sale of some city-owned property. But there was no decisions made at those, and no formal actions taken by the council except to direct staff to continue working on each one of the 3 projects. There was also a personnel, but there was no action at the personnel executive. You know, in our discussion afterwards, it was a thing where I mentioned sending out the letters to all the voters. I failed. Commissioner Henry was there earlier, but he didn't stay for the long executive session, which I don't blame him. Most of the folks left. But I should have mentioned earlier that one of the things that the commission might want to look at is our voter list, because it winds up being a thing where I think years ago, if you didn't vote in 3 elections, they took you off the voter registration. Well, at this point, there were folks who left that my kids knew, friends that left our community 20 years ago, who are still listed.
They're still listed. Oh, no.
So, you know, we could have stuffed the ballot box this year if we'd have just sent all of our friends who now don't live here absentee ballots.
And it would have been allowed because they're on the roll.
They're on the roll.
So, well, Mayor, as always, we thank you so much for taking time and being with us to talk about it. And
encourage everybody to go vote. Early voting's still open. It is open 8 to 6 on Saturday even this week, and every day this week at City Hall. And obviously the election is next Tuesday. If you didn't vote early, make sure you get out and vote on Tuesday and ask the candidates what they're for, make an informed decision, and go vote.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor.